Thank you so much. That was fantastic. Our next speaker is Emilie Hammen, who is a junior professor of art history and fashion history at the Université Paris Panthéon-Sorbonne. She's author of the book L'idée de mode, nouvelle histoire, which was published just last year. Her research considers the history of French fashion from the 19th century and its relationship with art, especially with the avant-garde. She will be speaking today about archiving the Maisons, building French fashion heritage from the 1980s. Please join me in welcoming Emilie.
Thank you, Valerie. Thanks to the team for making this possible. I'm thrilled and honored to be here this afternoon. Quite an eventful trip to New York. Can come back to Paris with lots of interesting stories. So I would like to start this short talk by showing you 3 examples. The first one, the image, the illustration, is just about a century away from the contemporary context, which I will be discussing further. But I found it to be very enlightening. It represents a public demonstration of specialized craft during the Paris World Fair of 1867. The petits métiers, or small trades, that make the distinctive Parisian fashion industry, are displayed and performed here with 2 aims. Alongside a musée de l'histoire du travail, showcasing historical artifacts such as example of printed fabrics or fans, they seek to demonstrate how contemporary industrialists are in fact preserving century-old skills while using them to perpetuate the superiority of contemporary French decorative arts and fashion. For instance, that same year and the following ones, the lace maker Auguste Lefébure would use the context of the fair to show how he had reconstituted the lost secrets of the century-old Alençon stitches in his own workshops. The second document you can see here is an important chapter, in the writing of French fashion history. I consider it as one of the earliest attempts at tracing the genealogy of the phenomenon known as haute couture, as both a creative and industrial turning point, a moment when historians, this is 1895, were still only finding pre-revolutionary clothing, so anything before the 19th century, worthy of attention and study. This report, ordered by the Ministry of Commerce, was written by Gaston Worth, the son of Charles Frederick Worth, who has since then been recognized as the founding father of haute couture. The last example, I'm showing you here, are views from an installation held just a few weeks ago in Paris by Maisons Martin Margiela. As you can see, it looks quite like an exhibition, using the types of display and mediation one could expect in a museum. It was, in fact, an opportunity to present a selection of pieces from the latest ligne artisanale, so this is Margiela's haute couture line, designed nowadays by John Galliano, and for him to show the original craft techniques he conceived, coining along the way a few original words such as retrograding or aquarelling. The curatorial project, conceived by Galliano himself, extended well beyond the conventional context of a showroom, which it was in part, allowing the press and buyers to, as we say, re-see the collection after a show. Rather, it offered the visitors the chance to appreciate the pieces alongside Galliano's inspiration, the work of Vionnet, the photographs of Brassai's very louche Paris, and for us to perceive the garments as artifacts with a strong heritage value. You may have remembered how this show was credited by the press, it was just last January, as one of the most powerful collections in Paris that season, and one of the most successful for the British designer now at the helm of the Margiela brand. So considered together, these three first examples highlight important aspects of fashion heritage in France, from past to present. Firstly, they remind us that producers, whether industrialists or couturiers, play a crucial role in the writing of the field's history, a reality demonstrated by their strong interest in collecting and preserving the archives needed to establish these historical narratives, while, and this is an important aspect to stress, serving, of course, their creative process. And finally, we understand here how instrumental the use of the space and rhetoric of the exhibition is. But, and this is the focus of my talk, from the 1980s onwards, we can observe a decisive shift, a transformation into something somewhat more systematic. Archival spaces and teams are being formed within the fashion houses in Paris. This talk will seek to understand this turning point by recontextualizing it in the political, economic, and cultural history of France. Through a few case studies, we will try and understand for which purposes and through which approaches this increased interest in archiving practices took place in Paris. It should allow us to conclude by shedding light on some aspects of today's reality. If you'd had the chance perhaps recently to go to Paris, the city has now 4 permanent fashion museums to visit, 2 of which are the results of private initiatives from the industry itself. So, alongside painters, couturiers were among the first and most avid collectors of historical garments and accessories. Jacques Doucet, a founding member of the Société d'Histoire du Costume, contributed with various 18th century gowns to what is today the Palais Galliera, so the City of Paris's Fashion Museum's own collection. Garments given by the House of Worth can also be found, and since the 2012 exhibition Balenciaga, Collectionneur de Mode, displayed his personal collections of folk and historical dress, we have come to understand the wealth and span of the Spanish couturiers' archive, which are now kept, this part, in Galliera. Most recently, through the opening of the Alaya Foundation and the exhibition presented just a few months ago at Palais Galliera, entitled Asdine Alaya, Couturier Collectionneur, we have only started to catch glimpses of the late couturier's over 20,000-piece rich archive of garment. Collecting practices have served to feed the imagination, to foster creativity by providing an archive of volumes, cuts, constructions, trims, and patterns. These collections have also shaped a canonical history, with couturiers recognizing amongst themselves the names of their predecessors worthy of being remembered, claiming lineages and self-established genealogies, something we can perceive here in Alaya's quote. Quote, "For many years I have been buying and receiving dresses, coats, jackets who illustrate the great history of fashion. It has become a corporist attitude for me to preserve them, a sign of solidarity towards those who, before me, have met the pleasures and demands of the scissors. It is an homage I pay to all trades and to all the ideas these clothes express." But in these early examples and initiatives, perhaps the case of Jeanne Lanvin brings an interesting perspective. Based both on oral history and very tangible evidence, the current head of the Heritage Department, Laura Rivel, has retraced the history of Berthe, a woman named Berthe, or Bertha, who was hired by Jeanne Lanvin herself as early as the interwar year to begin organizing and classifying the couturier's collection. So the finished pieces from previous collections, but also, quite interestingly, the sketches, the embroidered samples, the photographs, and the related press coverage. Lanvin's interest in establishing collection of historical fashion through practices of collecting would continue through to the next generation, with her nephew, Jean Gaumont-Lanvin, becoming the first secretary of l'UFAC, which is more or less what has formed now the fashion department of Musée des Arts Décoratifs, or MAD. The strategies foreseen by Lanvin in the 1920s would reappear over half a century later in the context of Paris fashion. While in the mid-1960s, just a few years after opening his haute couture house, Yves Saint Laurent began keeping some pieces from his collections, the hiring of Hector Pascual in 1981 marks a shift. Trained as a costume designer, the first conservateur of the house, or curator, was tasked by the couturier and his partner Pierre Berger with collecting and organizing the archival material of the various collections, from sketches to collection charts, from toiles to finalized prototypes. The early inventory would introduce a more systematic process. Instead of relying fortuitously on unsold looks, which was the case often, and the habits of keeping work-related documents, which I would argue is a practice almost conducted in any office, the collection sought to establish a more comprehensive corpus. It would eventually move outside of the couture house itself and to the new neighborhood at the time of La Villette in northern Paris, and then benefit from more professional museum-quality facilities, especially in terms of storage and conservation. It also very conveniently served the famous curatorial project that Diana Vreeland conducted at the Costume Institute in 1983. The Yves Saint Laurent retrospective entitled 25 Years of Creation. It was followed 3 years later by 28 years of creation at the newly opened Museum of the Arts of Fashion, Musée des Arts de la Mode in Paris. A similar situation occurred in 1987, so just a year later in the same museum. Hommage to Dior, 1947-1957, was conceived as early as 1983 as a joint project between the soon-to-be museum and the company, at the time still owned by Boussac, so before Bernard Arnault would buy it, in order to celebrate its 40-year anniversary. While the museum, through the association of UFAC, had already a rich collection of Dior pieces, the team hired a researcher, Elisabeth Fleury, to gather documentation and start retracing the history of the decade during which the founder led his company. She was especially focused on gathering sketches from the hand of the couturier himself to be able to retrace the complete creative process. In an interview published in Le Jardin des Modes, a French magazine, she refers to her quest in the basement of the Maisons, going through boxes of unsorted documents, and a couple of those boxes marked "to be thrown away," in which she would eventually find the sought-after illustrations. The article is also insightful, as it reprints an interview with Marguerite Carré, the head of the atelier, who sheds light on the work habits and the reality of designing the collections, alongside Dior just 30 years back. There's Marguerite Carré, but there are a few more, and that's quite interesting to see how they're researching and interviewing many of the staff that had accompanied Monsieur Dior. So this is one quote: "Did Dior have a favorite fabric? Perhaps the Starella from Staron, a light taffeta which didn't have this usual sadness found in taffeta. It was sprinkled with little grains. There was another fabric from Staron, a matte one, sublime. Dior would also have fabrics developed for him by Bianchini." So while the interest of Diana Vreeland for Paris-based couturier or the realization of landmark anniversary may explain some of these early initiatives, it feels the broader political and industrial French context must be addressed. I had just mentioned the Musée des Arts de la Mode, which exemplified the ambitions of the then President François Mitterrand in his cultural program led from the early 80s by Jacques Lang, his Minister of Culture. So perhaps another fashion exhibition might be quite interesting here to consider. We are at the Center for Industrial Creation, le Centre de Création Industrielle, part of the Modern Art Museum, which is known as well as the Pompidou Center. This is in June 1985, and the exhibition is called La Mode en Direct. It sought to look back at 25 years of ready-to-wear in France, while highlighting its current leaders. The more established generations among which Azzedine Elaya, Jean-Paul Gaultier, or Marc Audibet, alongside newcomers. It aimed to give visitors a very detailed explanation of the industrial reality of ready-to-wear and the steps to follow to make it in the fashion industry, from education to early career advice. As the exhibition's, Textile du Nord, Culture and Industry, or Dessins et Modèles Déposés, demonstrated just a few years previously, the mission of this CCI, Center for Industrial Creation, was truly to support the development of design industries in France. With more of a business history perspective, when we consider the decade of the 1980s, they represent a time of great challenge, if not complete crisis, in terms of industrial competition and productivity. And an interesting shift as well for fashion. After over 2 decades of couturiers designing ready-to-wear, the legacy left by the last surviving haute couture houses was left to be questioned. Was their cultural value and business models relevant in any way? Should haute couture fade away or be revived, as Christian Lacroix would attempt? That moment of the 1980s is in fact precisely when a strategic shift happens, a moment when the very definition of the heritage brand in the field of French luxury is being forged. Invited for a television talk show in 1987, Marie-André Jouve tells a story quite similar to that of Flory, so the researcher who had done the research for the Dior exhibition. She says that in 1980, it was in the basement of Avenue Georges V that she found in the boxes a series of about 100 dresses by Cristobal Balenciaga. Presented the next year in an exhibition in Tokyo, they would eventually form the basis of the brand's current heritage department and gave her the material needed to publish a first monographic publication. Throughout the 1980s, the brand would go from being owned by a German pharmaceutical company to a French beauty specialist. It will also enter several licensing deals before asking designer Michel Goma to introduce a ready-to-wear line in 1986. But surely the most successful example to consider in this context is that of Karl Lagerfeld, named in 1983 at the helm of Chanel. A little over a decade after the passing of Gabrielle Chanel, the couture house had also branched into ready-to-wear during the 1970s, with the contribution of Philippe Guy Bourget, once Marc Bohan of Dior's right hand, and the mind behind the ready-to-wear line Miss Dior. When Lagerfeld arrives Rue Cambon, a seasoned stylist mastering industrial design processes, he has yet, as WWD puts it, to tackle couture. He would collaborate closely with Marie-Louise de Clermont-Tonnerre, who, already a few years into her position at Chanel, was responsible for press relations. Clermont-Tonnerre had, according to several interviews I've conducted with the current team, she really had this intuition of the importance of collecting archival pieces. Alongside Lagerfeld, they would truly shape both a new department and a new way of addressing the past from a fashion house, as the designer so eloquently illustrated it in this 1991 sketch of himself. Quoting Goethe and his idea of building the future with the expanded elements from the past, he established a systematic inventory of the elements composing the style of Chanel. As opposed to Dior or Balenciaga, the basements of Rue Cambon, where the House of Chanel historically opened and still operates today, so the basements didn't offer boxes of treasures like a Dior or Balenciaga, quite the opposite. So together, Lagerfeld and Clermont-Tonnerre would study auction sales, private collections across the world, to track some of the pieces they deemed important to recreate the legacy of the brand. Wanting to establish a more precise visual culture of Chanel, Lagerfeld also worked with iconographers to create books of historical images, sketches, photographs, and so on, in an effort to absorb the very essence of her work. Collection after collection, over the almost 40 years in which he served as the creative director of the Maisons, Lagerfeld would make the history of the brand readable through his own lens and interpretation, of course. Articulating key elements and artifacts into a succession of chapters, he would offer his own deciphering of the Chanel history. Quote, breakage is therefore the postulate of interpretation, which is constructed as of the present time, ponders Michel de Certeau just a few years before in his 1980 essay, The Writing of History. So following the likes of Gaston Worth, which I mentioned in the introduction, Lagerfeld forges a history of his own field in the context of the transition between couture and ready-to-wear and the rise of heritage-based luxury. He grasps a new professional role and identity, that of the creative director as we understand it today, whose work would define above all and for the next decades fashion as a practice of image making. In 1989, so just 6 years after the beginning of Lagerfeld's tenure at Chanel, an exhibition is organized in Marseille, in the south of France, at the Musée Borelli. It is made possible by the institution's recent purchase of a personal collection of a close collaborator of Mademoiselle, but it also displays the growing collection assembled by the brand itself. It's divided into 3 chapters, pieces from the 20s and 30s, another part from 54 to Chanel's death in 1971, and, quite interestingly, a series of looks from both haute couture and ready-to-wear lines designed by Lagerfeld over the past 6 years. The first exhibition in France, focusing on the couturière, it brings an interesting perspective on her design process. A text by Edmond Charleroux, sort of her most prolific biographer, situates key information about the life of Gabrielle Chanel, but the research conducted by Catherine Ormen through interviews, once again, with what we call première d'atelier, head of the workshops, who had worked alongside Gabrielle Chanel, sheds a very interesting light to her unique approach to pattern making, draping, cut, and construction. But this exhibition also evidently introduces an idea, which we see through these few photographs, that of continuity beyond the reinvention, a sense of lineage, again, between Gabrielle Chanel and her successor. Lagerfeld here is a key player in the formation of this narrative. He pens a short essay in the catalogue in which he quite insightfully recontextualizes the work of Gabrielle Chanel. It's a side note, but he says something that it's not so recognizable. In the 20s, everyone was doing little black dresses. And I think it connects a lot with what we could see in the Woman Dressing Woman exhibition at the Met. If you notice the part where it was demonstrating that Gabrielle wasn't the only one doing black dresses. Well, Lagerfeld was very aware of this in 1989. And as a photographer, as you can see here, he further established a sort of Chanel iconology where symbols are reactivated from past to present. So now to futures. After 4 decades of thorough collecting practices and archival projects, heritage brands have become a staple of the Paris scene. Almost every season, every fashion week, it appears to be an opportunity to understand how a newly appointed creative director may design from a Maisons archive, with critics eager to judge how respectful of the legacy he or she may be. In 2019, this exhibition entitled Dialogues, L'Envin, 130 Years, created by Judith Clark with the house's archive and presented in Shanghai, was an opportunity to display the pieces once collected by Bertha, which I mentioned previously, to demonstrate the same logics of continuity and reinvention under the new creative leadership of Bruno Siaeli, who's no longer at the head of L'Envin. But conceiving exhibitions organized by fashion brands solely as devices to reflect on brand identity, while entirely true, is, I would argue, only a partial view. And even more so for the Maisons who have begun this process of self-narrating and self-exhibiting decades ago. Somehow the writing of their history into chapters may appear to be somehow resolved. So can there be an originality, a specific genre, pertaining to these collecting and exhibition practices? To try and answer this and to conclude this talk, I'd like to go back to the Centre Pompidou. La Traversée des Apparences is an exhibition that opened this past January in a museum who, as we have just seen, had in its early years in the 1970s and 80s, demonstrated a keen interest in understanding fashion for the complex design and artistic practice it is. But this recent curatorial project is quite different. It seeks to bring, I quote, fashion into the museum. It follows past exhibitions such as Yves Saint Laurent au Musée, where dresses were exhibited alongside paintings, preferably matching the paintings. Faithful to a tradition held by Fine Arts Museum, it seeks to establish the canonical history of modern art through a succession of masterpieces. We can think here of Alfred Barr's famous charts on the origins and evolution of modern art and how we've moved on. Fashion is introduced in this succession of painted masterpieces through the premise of chromatic similarities between the artworks and contemporary dress, with the ambition of creating, I quote, emotional correspondences. So this is the reason why Sonia Delaunay and Robert Delaunay are sharing a room with young designer Charles de Vilmorin. The fact that they both have bright colors in their respective works. As I'm sure you're aware here, over the past 20 years in her research and publications, art historian Nancy Troy has encouraged us to see beyond the superficial visual parallels, which have often limited our understanding of the artistic quality of fashion to dresses and jackets that looked like painting. Interesting to note then that in 2024, the Modern Art Museum reiterates the very opposite, as if in 21st century Paris, fashion should still conform to these canonical, if not retrograde, conception of art in order to be exhibited in an art museum. Of course, this is much more understandable to attract new visitors into their permanent galleries. In a surprising paradox, I have found quite thought-provoking counterpoints to this reality in the exhibition projects carried out by two couture houses often praised for their artist-like quality and their quote-unquote genius founders. In 2000, the very first Yves Saint Laurent Museum opened in the north of Paris, in the 19th arrondissement, with an entire exhibition of toiles, so rather poor objects, the first prototypes conceived in cotton muslin, which bear traces of the dialogue, if not tension, between creativity and technicality. A forward-thinking approach we would, I feel, more spontaneously associate with Antwerp's MoMU. Perhaps some of you remember the inaugural exhibition on patterns in 2003. In the following years, the Saint Laurent Museum would dedicate also an exhibition to Saint Laurent Rive Gauche, in the same way that the Dior Gallery recently displayed its Miss Dior line and licenses. Both approached issues of originality and reproduction, circulation and replication, copy and imitation, challenging the very romanticized view of the unique masterpiece on display at Centre Pompidou. Lastly, in the past few years, the House of Balenciaga has held exhibitions for the European Heritage Days in September, les Journées du Patrimoine. Curated in-house by the head of archive Gaspard de Massé, they've offered, in 2022, an opportunity to reflect on practices and purposes of archiving and conserving heavily damaged dresses. But also a chance to hear stories told by distressed and repaired materials, again, far from the finished and polished end products. This past September, by looking at the legacy of Balenciaga through the woman who wore his dresses, the exhibition considered the often neglected diversity of body types, which make the actual clientele of any fashion house, instead of its models, which are mostly young, historically young and skinny. This exhibition was quite wonderful because it considered the great variety of age, body types, and proportions that the couturier really had to work with. And this is what is exemplified by the poster here. So basically this relationship between anatomy and dress and the very idea of fashioning a body. This ongoing curatorial project, and I'm eagerly awaiting the next one in September, also interestingly sheds light on the crafts pertaining to exhibitions, from mounting and textile conservation, as it was the case in 2022 with this exhibition of damaged dresses, to mannequinage, the preparation of padded structures supporting the historical pieces, which I'm sure most of you are familiar here if you work in exhibitions. So just to conclude, since 1867 in Paris, when makers are collectors and when makers are curators, the so-perceived art of fashion is in fact much more than an artifact, a more dynamic and complex process of manufacturing, which challenges established genres and taxonomies of collections and exhibitions. Thank you.
Hello, hi. My question is about the first presentation, please. Hello. So my question is, how do you believe, well, first with the works that come out in recent times, such as Beyonce's Renaissance, how do you believe that the resurgence of house music and ballroom in the mainstream culture is opening doors for more of an understanding of inclusivity?
Well, great question. I don't know if proper reference has been given, I think, to the founding of house music and kind of like the founders and the locations and the places where it was born and then spread. So I think there was a lot of adopting by, well-known, like Beyonce and others. I'm not saying, that have taken some of the house music, but I would like to see, some of the storytelling of where this all comes from. We see the reproduction of it, but I would like to see some narrative about the founding of it, the people that produced it, how it happened. It is out there on YouTube. I mean, obviously you can look at some stuff, some of the founders of house music, but I would like to see a little bit more. As far as does it encourage inclusion, I think hopefully people that are curious, when they hear it, look for its origin. So I think that does allow for the inclusivity and everyday people to be educated and start to do their own research to find more. So I think it does promote inclusivity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have two questions, one for each of you, rather similar. Emilie, let's take yours first. I was very interested in the way you were pointing out that some of these exhibitions that are being curated and put on by luxury houses are going far beyond the hagiography that sort of was a beginning to those and are exploring new themes. I wonder, can you talk about, do you see any trends in that way?
That's a very good question, but I think I can answer. I think what comes out the most is this idea of explaining perhaps more specifically the creative process, allowing the visitors to precisely what the Modern Art Museum is not doing, just presenting us the final masterpiece. And I feel there's more and more this idea of, okay, maybe it's because we're almost 40 years after the beginning of this great narrative, or mythology, that we're sort of, okay, taking a deep breath and saying we can maybe talk about what goes on behind and before, behind closed doors and before the different steps. And I'm not saying it's about sharing the ugly side of it, but it's more about sort of being very transparent about, okay, there are different steps, there's a variety of people involved, and this is what's quite interesting as well. As you know, I'm quite interested in these ideas, craft cultures in Paris, and I feel this is very much and I'm hoping it's going to become a bit of a trend, highlighting, and beyond this idea of making them in turn as artists or as using the canonical representation borrowed from arts, but sort of grasping a more specific understanding of this collective work that the worlds of fashion really are.
Yes. Thank you. And Alfonso, I mean, I look back in the 80s and 90s when I was visiting, you know, the Black Fashion Museum in Harlem, which is now part of the Culture and History, African American Culture and History Museum in Washington, D.C. I wonder, in the course of your research, do you find any interesting fashion archives or collections or objects when you were researching, say, fashion and jazz, or looking at hip-hop or other themes in Black culture? Any lesser-known archives or collections that we might not have heard of?
Well, I think in my while researching fashion and jazz, I mean, it's in the unexpected places. So it's in Tulane, you know, at Tulane University. I went down there, which is in New Orleans, and there's a tremendous amount of archives and sources that, you know, speak to the fashion of the period. I think it's almost anywhere. I'm just trying to think, like in Philadelphia right now, I'm just putting a project online, kind of more open access, which is the whole life of Bessie Smith during her time in Philadelphia, which is unsung. And so I'm basically combining music, images, and really telling her life story in Philadelphia over about 15 years. And from that, you know, I found in Philadelphia by digging hours and days at the Free Library of Philadelphia, going through the Philadelphia Tribune, which is a black newspaper, and thank goodness it's archived on microfilm. And so I think there's so much to be uncovered out there, and many people are working on it. It's not just me. Lots of people are working on it. So I think it's all around the world. Yeah. Go ahead.
No, that's a very interesting question. I think I could have had a parallel talk on the development of fashion sales in auction houses. And having conducted several interviews for this research, the reality is 20 years ago, fashion sales in big auction houses in Paris didn't interest anyone. And you could buy Yves Saint Laurent, you can buy, or maybe 25 years, you can buy Yves Saint Laurent, you could buy Chanel, you could buy all of these great names for almost nothing. And over the course of the few years, and especially in the last couple years, it's really become, so of course you're not making as much money as if you were selling paintings, but it's become something real with exhibitions held before the auctions, and it's a real. And the exhibitions are extremely interesting as well, because they bring together sometimes, same as in sculpture, painting, or anything, pieces that we haven't seen in a while. And no, it's become a real reality. And of course, the online business as well has been growing. I did an interesting talk not so long ago with a colleague who's not a researcher, but who's trained in, maroquinerie and bag making. And he's also been a collector and very active online. And he was telling us as well how a lot of this market now is also completely redefined by fakes, especially in the world of luxury handbags, past and present, not just the latest Louis Vuitton handbag. So this market is thriving, and it's an extremely interesting field to look at and to study. Yeah.
I had a couple questions. I was wondering for Emilie, if in your work with the Chanel company about Karl Lagerfeld's, when he revived it in the early 90s, did he address at all Chanel's role and her taintedness, if you will, during the Second World War? I mean, that, like, you bringing that up and me having just seen the new look on, Apple TV and stuff and the way she's portrayed there, I'm also very curious if how the French culture, I guess, is, considering the way that we've just seen her portrayed in that series.
The New Look series. We could do another conversation. Yeah, well, to answer shortly, I go back to that 1989 catalog, in the catalog there was a text by Edmond Charleroux, this French author, who was one of the early biographers of Chanel. And she, very early on, had addressed the chapter of Chanel during the war. In French cultural history, the whole moment of the situation of women who had collaborated during the war. And she really addressed this with the tools she had and the knowledge she had of it in the 80s. So it was not a secret. When I look at the way that Karl Lagerfeld started approaching it, I understand that his approach was very object-based. And in fact, I was quite surprised at how, of course, image and object-based. On one side, he's sort of building this vocabulary of Chanel, this real visual vocabulary of Chanel. And again, I was struck by how he worked with these incredible collections of images, trying to absorb all of this. And then the way he really studied the jackets, studied the dresses. And it was really about understanding the technique. From him, I didn't get any, for a variety of reasons probably, but I could feel that his obsession was the image and the object. But again, Edmond Charleroux, and it was reprinted in that catalog. So it was not something that was ignored. Then to say that the French had a very peaceful and easy relationship to the time of the Second World War in the 80s would probably be a huge lie. It's still a very complex history that's been navigated. And then the take of a recent TV show on it is yet another perspective. But yeah, there's been a lot of discussion in Paris, especially in the way that the show sort of characterizes a little bit the two positions between the good and the bad. And it's a little bit more complex.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Hi. I wanted to know, this is a question to the both of you, throughout you guys' creative processes, through research, what were some roadblocks you faced accessing the archives, and how did you persevere through them?
Well, I think for me, when I started out digging in archives, I really didn't have a plan in place, so I got distracted with documenting stuff that perhaps didn't have dates. So I kind of learned, what works and what doesn't. So thereafter, really, when I go into an archive, I'm really strategic about what type of information I want. One of the roadblocks I had one time is I contacted an archive in Mississippi, and they were going to let me look at public sheet music archives that were located there, but all of a sudden the communication just stopped, and I kept communicating, and I was like, okay, so something, I don't know the reasons of that, but it was Mississippi. So I said, with that roadblock, I said, published sheet music is everywhere, and then I was able to go down to the National Museum of American History. And one great thing is I went down there to look at the Duke Ellington collection. And while I was there, the woman said, do you know about published sheet music collection that we have? I said, no. So she went in the back, and that's when she brought out almost 100 years worth of published sheet music dating back to the 1840s. Wow. So in that collection, there's over 100,000 pieces of sheet music. And then I focused on about little over 100 that had particular Black content. So I would say as a researcher, I just recommend being open, talk to the people that are running the archive, say, what do you have? Tell me what what I don't know, let me know what's in the back. And so that's how you find those hidden gems.
I think for the research pertaining to this paper in particular, it was, yeah, I mean, quite pragmatically knowing the people in the different archive department, because of course the archive departments in the brand, while they can be open to researchers, as I was saying in my paper, they're also here to support of business, and most of their time and energy is put into that aspect of things. Doesn't mean that they're not open to other discussions, but sometimes it's a question of time. So this is maybe one aspect. And then maybe sometimes something to consider as well is, in the case of French fashion archives, these structures are quite new. So sometimes a little bit like what you were mentioning just now, I think talking as well with the people who have often been the first archivists or the people starting these collections. Of course they know what they have, but sometimes also through the sort of collection of oral history, just by having them talk about what they're doing, what they're organizing, I could understand things that I wouldn't have understood if I was just looking at the actual material. So yeah, probably.
Thank you both.